right, good afternoon. Let's get started. Our speaker next week will be Mitch Jacobson, who is the co-director of the ATI Clean Energy Incubator, and Mitch is actually here with us. It's a great pleasure to have you, Mitch, and we'll be even more delighted when you're up here next week talking to us on the building of a 2.5 billion clean tech community in Central Texas. So that will be next week, same time, same location. Please join us then. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Matthew Nordan, who is a managing partner at MNL Partners. MNL develops energy and environmental projects in global markets with a focus in China. Matt is the co-founder and chairman of the investment committee at Prime Coalition, a pioneering 501c3 nonprofit that is bringing philanthropic capital to energy innovation. Prior to MNL, Matthew was a venture investor at Venrock. Many of you probably have heard of Venrock, which is one of the world's oldest and most successful venture capital firms. Before Venrock, Matthew was the president of Lux Research, an advisory services firm for science-driven innovation, which he co-founded in 2004. He has testified before the Congress 4 times on emerging technology issues, was a founding member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Emerging Technologies, serves on the board of many different entities and companies, has accolades which are too long for me to spell out here. I'll just mention that he serves on the boards of FinSix, Boston Power, and Greentown Labs, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, clean tech incubator in the US. With that, please join me in welcoming Matt.
Hey. How are you all doing this afternoon? Great. All right. That's good. I would encourage you to be animated. I'm going to talk about a bunch of stuff. If you think I need to have my BS called out on me, or if there's something you'd really like to dig into, please feel free to raise a hand as we go along. If it gets to be too much, I'll push stuff off to the end, but would love to make this more of a dialogue than a lecture. Sometimes you can have the best of intentions and wonderful execution and a wonderful team, and you can still completely fail to achieve your objective because you are aiming at the wrong target. It's okay to laugh. It's good to laugh. And that is what I want to talk about with you this evening when it comes to energy and environment, that will explain some non-obvious career decisions on my part and perhaps inspire you. And to start, we sort of have to start with the problem. The problem is simply described as 3 numbers multiplied together, which I think of as the secret formula. Number 1 is people. You know how long it took to get the first billion people? 200,000 years. The next billion took 130 years. The next billion took 30 years, and since then we get another billion people about every 13 years. Number 2 is stuff per person, what economists refer to as GDP per head. And for their sins, there are some of them that have tracked this all the way back to 0 AD. And as you can see, nothing much happened until the New World was discovered in the America was founded in the 1700s. And about then everything went upward in a geometric curve that has never stopped. And then number 3 is the resources per unit of stuff, or the resource intensity of GDP. Kind of arbitrary what the resource is. It could be, hydrocarbons, fossil hydrocarbons. It could be water. It could be the carrying capacity of the climate for CO2. My favorite representation of this is here. This is China from 2000 to 2005. GDP per person went up 62%, an astonishing number for a moderately industrialized country. But oil per person for transportation use went up by 400%. So every unit of wealth that accrued to somebody dragged 6.5 units of oil behind it. Now you multiply these 3 things out, people times stuff per person times resources per unit of stuff, and the terms cancel, and you are left with a vertical wall of resources. So we need more of everything, more fuel, more food, more water, more critical materials. And that really just means that we need more energy. Because energy is, of course, the lowest common denominator of every one of those resources. If you have an infinite energy, you sort of don't care. You can reconfigure the chemical bonds in a plant to turn it into a liquid fuel that you put in your car's tank. If you have infinite energy, you sort of don't care about, running out of phosphorus. You can transmute elements to make all the things you need. So that then begs the question, where do we get abundant energy for a world of 10 billion increasingly wealthy people? You know as well as I do, and I don't know if this is controversial to say in Texas, so you tell me if it is. It is in my household. I grew up in a Southern Baptist, fundamentalist Christian, very conservative home, and my dad and I do not watch Fox News together. Anyway, the way we have conventionally chosen to get said energy is through burning fossil resources in the main, and that has led to a modern story, a familiar story of climate change, which I imagine all of you know, but as a refresher course, it goes a little something like this. In the last 100-odd years, atmospheric CO2 concentration has gone up from about 290 parts a million. This ends in 2010. We're now closer to 400 than we are 380. And at the same time, surface temperatures have gone up by about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. If we get beyond 2 degrees Celsius, about 3.5 degrees F, we are screwed. And we are on track to do exactly that by 2050, when my daughters, will, be my age. We are already starting to see the early results of that in the form of very unhappy polar bears and very unhappy farmers and very unhappy New Jerseyans and the extinction of species. That little guy in the lower right is the South American golden toad, the first confirmed kill of climate change. And if we don't get a handle on this, we face a future for my daughters, but certainly for their children, that is all about flooding, famine, disease, and war. So, what are we going to do about that? We have fought a battle in these United States to solve this problem here on our own soil. And we have a variety of things that we should be very happy about and proud of. We now have solar on north of 750,000 homes and businesses in the U.S. When I first built this slide, a few years ago, that was 500,000. So the pace has really been extraordinary with the rise of solar resource like Solar City. We now have, this is outdated by a year, 336 gigawatts of wind that, serves 4 to 5% of the kilowatt hours that, we end up consuming in this country. And North American energy efficiency programs where we pay people to use less energy. The 2015 number isn't done yet, but in 2014 was almost $10 billion. And, we've also invested a bunch of money in startup companies that have solutions to these problems. Over the last 15 years, about $28 billion, launching north of 1,000 startup companies, although watch the trend there. And this has been lucrative for people. If people don't achieve wins in something, societies get what they celebrate. And if we don't celebrate, winners who pull it off and have them be rewarded in some way, you're not going to get more of it. I've personally enjoyed that. One company that I was privileged to be able to back in my time at Venrock is Nest Labs. Founded by Tony Fadell and Matt Rogers, the sort of father of the iPhone and his boy wonder product developer. And it was an extraordinary ride. Company founded in 2010, launched its product just a year and a half later. By 2013, cumulative Nest thermostats had saved 1 billion kilowatt hours, and Google bought the company the following January for $3.2 billion. That was an extraordinary rocket ship ride of a company. It remains the largest outcome of a venture-backed energy technology company that we've had to date. And I will tell you here and now that it absolutely does not matter a lick when it comes to scaling the world for 10 billion people. Because solutions like these are lucrative and they're wonderful entrepreneurial successes, but they hit right down the middle of the bullseye at the wrong target. Let me explain what I mean by that. I think it is somewhat foolish for us to think that we will avert a catastrophic future when it comes to resource innovation. And I don't just mean sort of, carbon pollution. I mean, we've solved that problem, right? Tomorrow morning we get the benign baseload power we need. We're just going to run out of something else. We're not going to solve that problem here. And there are three reasons why. The first one is that, in industrialized economies, developed economies like ours, we're already using less energy. This chart is energy use per capita and all types, so, transportation fuels and electricity and heating, everything on a per capita basis. The U.S. Was relatively flat from sort of the Carter administration through the late 2000s, but now is clearly headed downward. from a much lower base. China, India, Brazil, countries with, in two of those cases, more people, that are way lower on a per capita income basis are headed up. You look at this and initially you're not that scared. You're like, well, Matthew, why are you freaking out? The average guy in China right now is using less than a third the amount of energy that, we do in America. Well, they've also got 4 times as many people, which means on an absolute basis they exceeded us in 2010 and still have 4x higher to go in terms of how rich everybody's got to get before they get our standard of living. And, rest assured, people will not accept a lower standard of living because they sat at the back of the bus and happened to get rich last. Number 2, we have very calcified infrastructure. So think about, a baby's bone structure, right? If all the bones aren't fused yet. So if the child comes out, my daughter had hip dysplasia, what do? They put a brace on her because her body is still plastic. It can still be formed before everything sets. That is not true of my head, right? This is about as hard as it's going to be. And our infrastructure is like that because it's calcified. It's locked into. To give you an example of this, there was a beautiful moment in the United States where we actually had more electric cars on the road than gasoline-powered cars, but it was 1900. There were 8,000 cars, of which about a quarter were gasoline-powered, about a third were electric, and about a third were steam, a technology we did not pursue. Reasonable people could sit around at a cocktail party at the turn of that century and have an argument about which one of these would win. These are newspaper ads from that time. Look at them. Steam is the best power for automobiles. The one on the lower right is a New York Times article about an electric car making a record 100-mile run. Sadly, it killed a dog on the journey. We could have gone down any of these 3 paths. We picked one, right, with very clear environmental consequences, let alone geopolitical consequences, right? And we can't put the genie back in the bottle. That's done. The takeover time alone that it's going to take to get electric vehicles on our roads is pretty massive, let alone building out charging stations instead of gasoline stations. So we get excited. These numbers are a little out of date, but even now, if you have 3 or 4 times as many EVs on a road, there's still well under 1% of cars. And getting around that clock is going to take a very long time. If you really wanted to focus on impact, why on earth would you focus in the place where people are A, already rich, and then secondly, you've got this locked-in infrastructure you have to fight against? You'd rather start somewhere where nobody's driven a car, at least most people haven't. Then the third one is that we just don't have many shots on goal. This part of the talk goes better in Massachusetts than it does in Texas, but think about how frequently you see a new gas station get built, right? Think about how frequently you see new street lights go up, or about how frequently a new power plant gets built. That may actually be the best one. So if you look in the U.S., right, just at electricity demand over the last 10 years, same chart as beforehand, except this is just electricity, not all energy, right? The blue line is the U.S. This is not on a per capita basis. This is absolute basis. The red line's China. Pretty obvious trend here. We're flat. They've more than doubled. So put that into numbers, right? Over those 10 years, the U.S. started out using about 4,000 terawatt hours of electricity consumption a year. China was at 2,370. 10 years later, we're roughly flat. They've more than doubled. Specifically, we've added 67 terawatt hours of new demand. They have added almost 3,000. Now, if you assume that the same 500 megawatt, 90% capacity factor coal-fired power plant you build in either place does 4 terawatt hours a year, that means that for the purposes of meeting new demand in the U.S., we put up a new power plant about once every 7 months over a decade. For 7 months, they built one every 5 days. If your goal is to get insertion of new technology and to build something at scale for the first time, why on earth would you do that in a place where you get 2 shots a year versus 1 shot a week? You should care about this. You should certainly care about this if you are an environmentalist. I am an environmentalist. I try to, put these things into work in my real life. In the brutal New England winter, I am driving my crappy used car. I ripped up my front yard and planted food. There is something about ripping up your front yard and planting food. It makes you unpopular with your neighbors until you start bringing them delicious food. And then secondly, it makes it very easy to find your house. I tell people, drive around Winchester, Massachusetts until you see the one with the corn. But you may, in fact, not care about these things. You should still care anyway. Maybe what you care about instead is poverty. And you think, well, Matthew, it's all nice and good to wave your arms about, energy this and environment that, but if people can't eat, that's a bigger problem. Well, if you care about poverty, you should probably also care about energy poverty, designed as not having household access to electricity or clean cooking fuels, which impacts about 1.5 billion people on our fine planet, and is one of the best predictors we have of standard of living. On this chart, every red square is a country. The x-axis on a log scale, right, so sort of a scale, is annual per capita energy use in BTU. On the y-axis is the country score on the UN Human Development Index, which measures longevity, educational attainment, and per capita income. The message from this is that when you have energy, you live longer, you learn more, and you earn more. But maybe you don't care about that. Maybe you are voting for Ted Cruz in this election, and as a result, you think, that's nice, but not my problem.gif. And instead, I just care about peace. I just don't, want to be fighting wars elsewhere about resources that we shouldn't have to battle over, which is a legitimate view of the world. If that's the case, you should still also care about this. I will use the Chinese example here. Chinese military spending is now like around $12 billion a year. A lot of that, and it's growing at about 10% a year. A lot of that money goes toward building a so-called blue water navy, which means one that can pitch a naval battle anywhere in the world. They are now up to 69 submarines. And you might say 69 submarines, it seems a little crazy. China's territorial disputes are with Japan over little outcropping rocks of islands, and they don't have a big fleet. They're with Taiwan, which is a missiles throw away. Why on earth would you want to have 69 submarines? 69 submarines would come in pretty handy if a rival nation decided to block the Malacca Strait, which is the primary trade route by which oil-laden tankers go from the Middle East and South China Sea. In that instance, 69 submarines would be a pretty useful thing to have. So you can see here, one of the world's greatest powers, and one with a hell of a lot more manpower than we've got, actively preparing for a resource war of the future. So, I thought about these things for many years. I started my career in the technology analyst world, first at a public company called Forrester Research that studies the internet and digital media, and I was there for about 7.5 years. Around 2003, I had a bit of an epiphany. I felt like if the last 30-odd years had been about the microprocessor and its offspring, like if you were an anthropologist from Mars and you were trying to say, what were the humans up to for the last few decades? That was the answer, like they did chips. I felt like the next 30, 40 years would be about how you scale the world for 10 billion people and double the size of the consuming class of people who eat beef and drive cars. And I thought that was much more about hard technologies, about energy and food and water. So I quit my job. I found some like-minded buddies at a little venture capital firm in New York called Lux Capital and started a business called Lux Research that is the sort of market researcher and consultant advisor, largely to big companies, about energy and environment. And it's now about 150 people with practices in solar and energy storage and water, but began life as me and 9 unpaid university interns terrified that we would run out of money before someone bought something. I did not intend to become an investor. I held venture capitalists in fairly low regard, but I observed a large amount of money coming into energy and you have a puzzled look on your face. Why is that? Yes? No? Okay. Gotcha. Okay. But I saw a large amount of venture money coming into energy and environmental companies in the mid-2000s, and I thought, a lot of that's probably being misspent, because if these companies in general need more time and more money and encounter more risk against a backdrop, where the cost of growing and scaling a software company has dropped by like 4 or 5 orders of magnitude, in the main, you're probably going to lose. You're going to lose the battle for returns and access to primary investment capital. And I thought the problem wasn't so much with energy and environment as a field, but more with applying the venture model to it. I'll tell you something. When you go around and speak at conferences criticizing an asset class of finance, people from that asset class start calling you up and saying, well, can you do any better? And I got asked to join this venture firm called Venrock, which was originally the venture arm of the Rockefeller family. It was born in the 1930s. If you've ever flown on a Boeing airplane on a United flight, you have encountered 2 Venrock-backed companies. And if you have an Apple computer with an Intel chip, you've run into 2 more. And my colleagues and I there built a portfolio of 9 energy and environmental startup companies. Some of those were focused on electricity. Some of those were focused on hydrocarbons. Some of them were focused on making more, in a cheap or environmentally benign way. And some on efficiency, on using less. And they ranged very widely. This company in the upper left, Tri-Alpha Energy, which has now come out of the closet, so I no longer have to have some obscure, Mawire pattern over them. is the world's largest privately financed nuclear fusion project, which we did with NEA, Redpoint, Goldman Sachs, the Wellcome Trust, and a variety of others, and has north of $500 million in it. Fun fact, Tri-Alpha came out of UC Irvine. If you go to a little nondescript office park outside the UC Irvine campus, you drive up this winding hill. And you pass on your right, they're all sort of large, like high school gymnasium-sized warehouse buildings. And you pass like the shoe warehouse, and then you pass like the injection molding plant. Then you pass a building with no sign. It contains a working boron-proton aneutronic fusion reactor. So look out for that if you're around Irvine at some point. And then, other companies that are sort of nearer term to market. Nest was one. Another company that I was very involved with is called Fin6, which radically miniaturizes power electronics. Its mission is to make your laptop adapter go away by just fitting it into the plug. Something surprised me as we built this portfolio and I worked with these companies. 4 of them got married to China, and none of them planned it. And in each case, it was transformational. 2 of those companies loaded up the truck and moved there and became Chinese enterprises. They both, as it happens, are in the value chain for electric vehicles. Boston Power, which is a lithium-ion battery maker, and Ateva, which is a drivetrain maker. And in both cases, they recognized the most supportive policy for electrification of vehicles at masses in this country. It has the lowest cost of capital. It is proximate to the most aggressive customers. It has the lowest cost of manufacturing. And they recognized that while R&D might remain in the U.S., manufacturing and the executive team needed to be elsewhere. 2 others very much remain Western technology companies, Phononic in the Research Triangle in North Carolina and Fin6 in Menlo Park. But I'll give you the example later on, but in both of these cases, we made the rounds to Western customers and got something between kind of ambivalence and aeon when we went to sort of aggressively expansionist, large enterprises in China and encountered a dramatic level of financial support. And I'll tell some stories about this later about how these were transformative for a few of these companies. When I saw this, I realized I was seeing a solution to the problem that had brought me into the venture world in the first place. That if the issue was, how are you going to get these companies large amounts of capital, not millions of dollars, but tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, to grow and scale, you were likely to do that not out of investment capital, primary dollars, which are going to be attracted just as water flows downhill, capital flows to its highest return. That money will flow to the Facebooks and Instagrams of the world, whether we like it or not. Instead, that capital was likely to come off of corporate balance sheets that had a strategic secondary motivation. And if it was going to come off corporate balance sheets, it would probably happen in the places in the world that have urgent energy and environmental needs that have to get addressed or they're hosed, versus in built-up Western economies like ours, where our energy and environmental issues are kind of optional to solve. So I voted with my feet, and I left Venrock and started a new firm called M&L Partners. It's for our last names, Manuel, Nordan, and Lamb. And we are sort of a hybrid of early-stage project development, so analogous to what a wind or solar developer does, sort of goes out, finds the sites, finds the financing, attracts the partners, and does that in exchange for a slice of project equity. And equity investor, so we not only develop projects, we invest in them. And we do this across borders. 90% of our work is in China. We do a little bit in Brazil and a little bit in the Middle East. And our partners are really sort of custom built to do this. I am the investor analyst phenotype. My partner, Greg Manuel, is the diplomat and deal maker. He was Condoleezza Rice's special advisor for energy when she was Secretary of State. The U.S.-Brazil biofuels partnership was his baby. He then joined a biofuel company backed by Kleiner Perkins and others called Amyris Biotechnologies, which went public largely based on the 5 cross-border joint ventures that Greg formed, one of which brought $180 million into Amyris and enabled it to go public. My doppelganger in China is Chivis Lam, 56 years old, spent about 30 years in Chinese industry as an executive in very large companies, Hong Kong Electric, GEC Alstom, and Morgan Crucible, but then joined probably the most successful venture capital firm in China called Ming Ventures, where he made a practice out of investing in Western energy technology companies, but then joining them for a year or 2 at a time to build out their operations in China. And I'll tell you a story later about probably his greatest hit. That make sense so far? All right, you guys have been remarkably non-interruptive, so I'm hoping for good questions later. Maybe you're saving it up. Our thesis is pretty straightforward. We identify urgent problems, we ally with heavyweights, and we then enlist proven innovators. Let me talk through each one of those at a time. If you want to get something big done, it needs to be both important and urgent. Are there any MBA students in this room? Oh, that's good. You guys are in the back because you're like the cool kids. You're like, just hanging out, you know. You may have seen at some point, right, the sort of executive tool, the important versus urgent matrix. Things that are important and urgent you do, things that are neither you don't, and, you know, yada, yada, yada. Same deal when it comes to getting big, you know, audacious things done, like a first-of-a-kind deployment of a Western energy technology in a developing country. And, you know, God bless them, you know, the Chinese leadership has experienced something extraordinary, right? You know, they've had this immense increase in wealth that's been accompanied by massive changes in everything, you know, changes in consumption, changes in migration, you know, changes in income inequality. And somehow they have been able to perpetuate their own existence. They've kept the car on the road while changing the tires at, you know, 80 miles an hour. And, you know, you don't do that by focusing on things that are not terribly important. You tend to triage your problems and focus on the urgent ones. As much as I would love to get excited about the CO2 mitigation pronouncements made during the summit between Presidents Xi and Obama last year, or about China's participation in COP21, I spend a lot of time in this country. I don't think carbon dioxide emissions are urgent. You know, it's a colorless, odorless gas that goes equally into the environment everyone shares. It doesn't impact local air pollution. It doesn't impact people's standards of living, at least not on a time frame that human beings evolved to understand. And while I see a lot of lip service being paid to CO2 in China, I honestly don't think anybody cares. Maybe that will change, you know, if you get the right policy instruments implemented at the right level, if you had, you know, a meaningful carbon price as opposed to the kind of unimportant carbon price that, you know, we have in the world's only regional trading bloc in Europe. But we'll see. Instead, we tend to focus on problems that are urgent, that do hit people where they live, that are policy priorities for the government, that have a pleasant side effect of reduced CO2 emissions. The biggest of those is particulate air pollution, right? That matters a lot. Let me give you an example of how this matters a lot. So there is a, am I going to talk about this again later? I just want to make sure I'm not going to preempt myself. I am not. So there is who in here has been to China beforehand? Oh, that's awesome. Anybody ever been to Wuxi? Okay, great. So China officially, oh, that's good. And there's an actual Chinese man in here, so that's helpful. So China's government officially ranks its cities into like first tier, second tier, third tier. Wuxi is officially a third tier city. It's like, congratulations, you're Milwaukee. But its population is such that if you moved it to North America, it would be bigger than everything except New York. And every day, Wuxi makes 4,000 tons of trash, of municipal solid waste. And historically, they have taken 2,000 tons a day of that and stuck it in a landfill. And then the other 2,000 tons has gone 1,000 each to 2 incinerators that burn the trash to make electricity, which outside of openly murdering puppies is one of the worst things you can do for the world. It puts an enormous amount of particulates, you know, SOx and NOx, which lead to smog, and CO2 into the air, as well as dioxins, which ultimately cause cancer. A few years back in Wuxi, the landfill started filling up. And the local government decided, well, our solution is that we are going to build a mega incinerator that will take over for the landfill and then have room to grow. It was mechanically complete in December of 2011. Now it's February 2016. It's never been turned on because of 3 years of citizen protests in the streets. Now, China does a good job of controlling access to its media, so if you Google citizen protest incinerator Wuxi, you'll find a remarkable absence of pictures. But trust me, I've been there. It's happening. So that's an urgent problem, urgent enough to threaten to destabilize the regime, right, to be the ultimate, you know, sort of infliction at the heart of the beast. Water problems are urgent. Astonishingly, 2/3 of China's waterways are deemed unfit for human consumption by its own government. My Chinese partner always tells me, don't do the fish slide. I hate the fish slide. Real problems with water. And as I mentioned beforehand, garbage is a huge one in built-up urban areas. They're out of landfill space. Incineration is being outwardly protested, by people who normally get harangued for doing protesting. They got to find something beneficial to do with the trash. Incidentally, in this picture, every time I put it up, I'm like, did they put a whale in that landfill? What the hell is that? But a pipe? I don't know what that is. Anyway, urgent problems. Number 2 is to ally with heavyweights. If you are the little guy, particularly the little guy, not on your home court, you can use a big guy to help you out. Sometimes that big guy is a battering ram. He or she knocks down doors you couldn't otherwise get into. Sometimes they serve as a consigliere. They give you advice and counsel so that you can accomplish things you otherwise might not. Sometimes they are just a protector, someone who has muscle that you don't. So in all of our efforts, they are all based around the union of a ready-to-scale Western technology that's been built and deployed and demonstrated its economics here or in Canada or in Europe. But then a big Chinese enterprise, 9 times out of 10 state-owned, that brings capital and market access and local know-how. But you have to select these companies extremely carefully, right? The standard retort of every CEO, on the Western technology side that we spend time with is, but won't all my IP be ripped off? And I'm like, probably, unless you do it right. And doing it right starts with selection of the right partner, where we look for 4 key things. The first one is financial strength. You get into trouble if you ally yourself with a company that is struggling. They then have motivations to cut corners. So we look for companies that have big balance sheets and are growing rather than shrinking and are actively looking for places to put their cash. Second, we look for evidence, not words, but evidence from past behavior of integrity and respect for IP. If you want to find large companies that have a track record of successfully having respectful partnerships with technology companies, you find companies that have had past partnerships with technology companies. There are other elements to this, but really past behavior is the big one. Third, we look for a high level of oversight. For example, our favored partner in China is ChemChina Blue Star for a lot of reasons. They have an executive team that has extensive Western experience, but their biggest asset is that they are 20% owned by a U.S. private equity firm, Blackstone, and they are on an acquisition spree in the West. You might have seen yesterday morning that they have made a bid to buy the chemical company Syngenta, which would be the largest acquisition ever of a foreign corporation by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. When you're listed on a Western exchange and you have private equity ownership from a heavyweight U.S. firm, it's just hard to have shenanigans, and that helps a lot. It also helps a lot to have political oversight. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Then lastly, this doesn't scale, but for us it doesn't have to. Our guiding principle in the beginning has been that we will not work with a Chinese partner where one of the 3 partners in our firm has not worked with the people on the other side, not the company, but the specific line of business executive whose budget we are touching, or been at most 1 degree of freedom removed. Again, that constrains us to probably 3 dozen companies, but if we can do dozens of projects with each of them, it still gives us a pretty big pool of fishing. So the last thing is we enlist proven innovators. We harvest, right? The pipeline coming out the other end of this venture and growth equity money that has caused Western technology companies to be able to scale. And with that in mind, I think the best thing is to sort of give you 3 case studies that are drawn, the first 2 from my personal experience, the last one from my Chinese partners, to just tell you what this looks like. So the first company is called Phononic Devices. They make what's called a thermoelectric. Anybody in here know what thermoelectrics are? What are thermoelectrics? Yes, that's exactly right. So they are magic materials that do something nature doesn't want you to have. They have very high electrical conductivity and very poor thermal conductivity. And what happens when you do that? Oh yeah, that's good. See, good job. He's like, I was like, did I say something wrong? No, that means 10 minutes. Okay, good. Anyway, what happens when you have a material is if you give it, hot on one side, cold on the other side, you can't get phonons to move through them, units of heat, and the energy's got to go somewhere, so you end up bumping electrons from the valence band up in the conduction band, and you get electric current. If you run it the other way around, you put current into it, you get separation of heat and cooling. So you can either use it for waste heat recovery, which doesn't work very well, or you can use it for solid state cooling. And when you do that, you are looking at things like refrigerators and air conditioners, all of which have a thing in it called a compressor, right, which today compresses gases, and that's how you get cooling. Compressors are just bad. They're inefficient, they're loud, they're expensive, they break, they have lots of moving parts, they're not very reliable. And you replace that really with a chip, and you blow air over the chip, and things get cool. And it's sort of better in every dimension. It's, it cools faster, it's less expensive, it has new moving parts, it's very reliable, it's lower cost, it's more energy efficient. The problem is it's new. And with Phenonic, we went around. I actually joined this company for 6 months as its sort of corp dev, biz dev guy when it didn't have one. And, we went to Siemens and General Electric and Bosch, all the usual suspects who make refrigerators and air conditioners, and said, hey, we'd love to partner with you for market introduction of this in one of your products. And in each case we got, our appliance units are sort of cash cows. The assets are depreciating. We only put into investment, a small amount of the profit that comes out every year. So we kind of love to do a long-term sort of R&D partnership. And we're sitting here just seeing years, right? We then went to Haier, H-A-I-E-R, which you probably don't know, but if you do, it is the world's largest maker of appliances. Chinese state-owned enterprise, the number one brand in China across any category. Just the number one brand, period. It's like Coca-Cola is in the U.S., Haier. And their CEO sat down across the table from Phononic's CEO and myself and said, I know how this works. I can't get on the shelves at Best Buy because nobody respects me, despite the fact that I'm the market share leader. But I've seen how this story goes. I saw it with LG and Samsung, who were C brands in the 1990s. And they went to A brand status in a decade through a combination of technology and design. And I'm going to do the same thing. And I'm going to introduce the world's first compressorless refrigerator, and you're my guy. And they did a $10 million prepaid purchase order, so $5 million up front and then $5 million on delivery of a first prototype. That obviated Phononic's need to raise a Series B round. It then allowed us to raise a $36 million equity round led by Chinese investors 3 years ago, followed last year by a $72 million follow-on round. Phenonic and Haier introduced their first product at the Consumer Electronics Show 2 years ago, and Phenonic is now a substantial top-line company and probably a 2 or 3 year IPO candidate. Never would have happened without the Chinese partner. Number 2 is Ateva. Ateva is an electric vehicle drivetrain company. It was born from Tesla. If you look in Tesla's S1 or early documents, you will find a board member turned executive named Bernie Say. Bernie ran the Tesla Energy division, whose mission was to build battery packs for other automakers. When the company had a different CEO, when Elon Musk came in and took over, he decided he didn't want that to be part of the company. Bernie asked for permission to do it as a separate business and got dispensation from the Pope and went off and built Ateva. Did you see the thing in the news, by the way, 2 days ago where Elon Musk got criticized by a VC, Stuart Alsop, and said, therefore, you cannot buy one of my cars? You should look that up. It's pretty funny. If I got, prohibited from buying things of people I've criticized, I would have problems. Never would have worked in the venture capital industry. Anyway, so Ateva started out building battery packs like what you see here, and then, sort of moved on to building full drivetrains, the, entire system that's propelling the car. The problem that we had is that, as we went from battery pack to drivetrain, et cetera, we realized we just need a completely different level of resource. And we're not going to go all the way to building a car, but that's really what we need to do. Because the issue is we're making great battery packs and great drivetrains, and our gap in getting to market is not sort of, economic support for EVs in China very strong. It's that the frickin' automakers can't get their stuff together to integrate a drivetrain into a car. So we did something surprising. Went to Beijing Automotive, which is the number 3 automaker in the country. We did a joint venture with them that involved putting together a joint team of car people from Beijing Automotive and drivetrain people from Ateva, and a $100 million equity investment in Ateva at a $300 million pre-money valuation, which was 10 times higher than where they had last raised money at in the U.S. That brought alongside it another $100 million from Chinese financial investors for a post-money of $500 million, and enabled the company to jump down the value chain all the way to building a car, hire away the designer of the Tesla Model S, and begin building a Tesla killer designed for the Chinese market, which means that all the cool stuff is in the back. Because if you can afford that car, you have a driver. The last one is LanzaTech. This is a production of my partner Chivas Lam. Lanza's technology is about taking the flue gas emissions from steel and cement plants, the stuff that comes out the smokestacks, and converting them into fuel, ultimately into ethanol through a microbial process, a bacterially mediated process. Same deal. Lanza looked at the universe and said, wow, we deal with cement and steel emissions. More than half of all steel is now made in China. And the steel plants in the rest of the world are kind of old and unlikely to be retrofitted. But there are a lot of new plants going up in that country. If there's a place we're going to deploy a new technology, that's probably it. My partner Chivas, when he was at Ming Ventures, led a Series B round in LanzaTech, but then joined the company as its COO to build out their Chinese operations. And in about 13 months, he established the wholly foreign-owned enterprise, recruited the team, got NDRC approval, so state council approval, to build a first plant and sell fuel ethanol, which requires a license in China. And then signed 2 joint ventures, one with Capital Steel, the number 6 steelmaker, and one with Bao Steel, the number 1 in China and number 2 globally. Bao participated in the Series C round, the next round. But it also took $10 million non-dilutively off its balance sheet to build a first demonstration plant to show that the technology worked and met its metrics. It operated for 9 months, was then dismantled and moved, and then Bao took $35 million off the same balance sheet to non-dilutively build the company's first commercial scale plant. That never would have happened in a million years, at least not at a price that would be acceptable in equity from Western financial investors. So I hope this, gets the story across. We face very severe energy and environmental challenges. While we may make our own backyards a more pleasant place to be in, maybe our front yards if you grow corn in them, we will not make our global backyard a better place by winning the battle on our soil. It will require winning where lots of people are getting rich for the first time. I have bet, at least this stage of my career, on the fact that that needle will get threaded through large companies, generally with a high degree of state control, that bring capital and market access and know-how that can take these technologies to life and deploy them at scale. That is my target. I don't want to be alone in shooting at it. I want the target to look like this. So I hope that there's somebody in the room, where this impacts the business you want to build or the type of financing you want to do. And with that, we should talk, because you haven't talked yet. I've talked too much. So what can I tell you?
If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll come over the mic. Go with students first. That's sort of the format here. So.
Yeah, take that. We are students of life.
No,
Yep.
great talk. Everything makes sense long term, but I'm just wondering what you think about the economic slowdown in China and the price of oil going down. I mean, that's got to change your conclusion somehow, right?
No, it's funny. It's subtle, right? When it comes to oil, it's positive and negative, right? The negative is that anything that is exposed to the oil price, for example, in China, the price of fuel ethanol is pegged loosely to Brent crude. There's a severe impact there, right? Your income statement changes almost immediately. But most things aren't. It cracks me up whenever you see a talking head on a news channel say, the Saudis are keeping the price of oil low because they want to kill solar. And it's like, do you realize we don't have oil-fired generation in the world much? Like, it's sort of not a thing. So I think the electricity markets are very different, and the water and sort of waste management markets are completely separated, and that's where most of our focus is. So that doesn't impact us a lot. It does occasionally. The Chinese economic slowdown is an interesting one, and I would say there's a difference between the real economy and the fake economy. The fake economy, which is about what you see in the share price movements and about a property asset bubble that has long needed piercing. There are real effects there, and anybody in real estate, anybody in sort of mainstream finance will have a hard life. When it comes to the real economy of being able to serve, what's transitioning from a export-driven economy to a domestic consumer-led economy, that doesn't really change at all. You may have slightly less consumption, slightly higher savings rate, but a delta on such a huge increase that it doesn't really impact us. If anything, from our perspective as project developers, what happened in the U.S., in 2009, right? Shovel-ready infrastructure projects became the order of the day and the focus of state stimulus. If that happens in China, that's actually a positive for us, not a negative. So if anything, when we look at the current economic conditions there, we think it's somewhere between neutral and good for us. The only downside, and this is why I say there's subtlety, is that the individual executives that we deal with, at the Bao Steel, Shanghai Electric, other type companies, are fairly affluent within their society, and they, may have real estate holdings or stock holdings that are impacting them personally that can distract them. So we got to make sure they stay focused.
Do you think part of your success, especially in the, technology world that you've had in China is because a lot of the rare earth elements come from there and they have access to almost every single one of them?
That's a good question. In sort of the things I've been involved with, there has been zero connection to rare earths. Although I do think that's an interesting problem. I brought in an intern a few years ago to sort of look at rare earths and their substitutes for a summer and figure out if there was an early stage venture play there. The conclusion was unfortunately no. However, I will tell you a goofy story. So a lot of the rare earth mining right in China happens in Inner Mongolia. And several years ago, I found myself in Inner Mongolia to meet with a battery company of all things, not what you expect to find there. But we got done fairly early, and there were these local economic, sort of government folks who had been showing us around. So we asked them, can you take us to a rare earth mine? And they're like, oh my God, no, it's radioactive. So they really don't want you to see the rare earth mine. Not big fans of that. Who's up?
Yeah, you mentioned needing to win in places where people are getting rich for the first time. And I was just wondering, does that influence opinions that you have about policy here in the United States, like maybe how we're investing money to mitigate environmental impacts, things like that?
When it comes to sort of policy questions, I feel like that's above my pay grade, or at least lateral to my pay grade. That's probably all I should say about that.
So operating in China, do you have any heightened concerns about intellectual property or patent protection or anything like that?
Let me tell you more stories. So once upon a time, this was way before I joined Venrock, but it was an earlier Venrock portfolio company. The firm backed a company called American Superconductor, which was born out of the lab of Ming Chang, who became an electrochemist at MIT, eventually launched A123 Systems in 24M, that made superconducting wire and got into sort of a few downstream applications, one of which was components for wind turbines. And they, I'm going to get this wrong, sort of latter half of the 2000s, like maybe 07, 08, signed it looked optically right from a distance. They signed a joint venture with a large Chinese wind turbine operator called Sinovel, where they would supply components and they would get paid for their hardware, and then they would have a licensing agreement for their control software that uniquely spoke to these components enabled by their superconducting wire. But it covered only a subset of the turbine SKUs that were shipped by Sinovel. Well, lo and behold, one day an American superconductor engineer climbs up and goes into the nacelle of a Sinovel wind turbine not covered by their licensing agreement. And he goes back to the console, pulls up the controls, and is like, looks a lot like our stuff. So he gets it on a flash drive. He looks at the components, thinks that looks similar too, but we didn't make them, goes away. When they decompile it byte for byte, it's just completely ripped off, like 100% ripped off. And the ensuing recriminations, right, because Sinovel had become American Super's largest customer, didn't bankrupt the company, but it did destroy 95% of their market cap as a publicly traded firm. And if you Google this, which I encourage you to do, it gets almost James Bond level, involving like Sinovel hiring prostitutes in Austria to wine and dine the engineer until he gave up the just ridiculous stuff. So, am I familiar with the fact that these things can go wrong, and do I worry about intellectual property? The answer is yes. But I would say that experience, as far as I understand it, is a great anti-case study, because it sort of had none of the attributes for success. The company on the other side was a struggling company in a commodifying industry, not a strong player that was rising with a big balance sheet. The joint venture did not involve cross-shareholding between the two, in one another's companies and joint funding of a legal entity. It was a shell container for a licensing agreement. There was no high-level political oversight when the JV was formed. There wasn't a senior U.S. government official shaking hands with his counterpart in China. There was no Western governance or ownership or executive experience inside the Chinese partner. And more importantly, the Chinese engineers on the Sinovel side were meagerly paid, giving them an incentive to do the wrong thing rather than the right thing. They didn't have bonuses and stock options, right? It would pay them better, to do the wrong thing and rip off the IP. Everything that we do in our firm is designed to sort of do the opposite of that, and have attributes that we think are designed for success. The way I think about it is if we walk out, side and grab a blade of grass, it's really easy to break. So sort of depending on one thing, for things to go right doesn't go well. But if you build a mat of grass and you have a whole bunch of different attributes, that's hard to break. And it doesn't guarantee that you'll be successful, but it does mitigate risk sufficiently that the risk-reward trade-off can make sense. Hey.
Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering if your partners and yourself see opportunities for low-tech interventions into the sustainability world.
Give me an example.
So an example, I think about these huge cities, Wuhan, Tianjin, Shanghai. In terms of transportation, maybe the best thing is not inventing the electricity-powered car, but getting people away from cars, right? Get them on bicycles, through urban planning, build the right type of city where you can walk to your job. So what type of commercial ventures could you get involved with, say with transportation, that avoids a car, where 50% of the impact on the earth, right, comes from the manufacturing process?
No, I'm totally with you. You're probably familiar that there are a bunch of Uber-alikes in China. You know, Uber-alikes, companies like Uber and, Lyft, may God rest their souls. Whose whole thing is, you can have the effect of a car with less car ownership and less whatever. It doesn't decrease miles driven, but it does, at least, affect sort of life cycle, impact of vehicle ownership. I think in sort of the tech world, there are a bunch of things like that that are sort of, about efficiency and convenience that get you somewhere. I think there are a bunch of opportunities in designing cities differently, et cetera. China has a bunch of sort of, showcase, new energy cities, as they tend to be called, that are like this. I think that's more of a real estate, sort of opportunity. It's not the kind of stuff we do, which is built around, technology. I think there's some software technology options there, and I think there's the integration of sort of well understood stuff, which is a great opportunity for some people. It's not really what we're good at. But yeah, there's definitely fertile ground there.
Hi. So
it's like efficient mic passing. I didn't even know it's there. Who is that guy?
So I guess like two things. You put up the graph of like clean energy venture capital financing, and then said you noticed a trend and it dipped post 2009.
Sure.
Another thing is you're focusing your case studies on the fact that you have ready deployed technologies, and you're going to China to kind of scale and deploy them there because of capital and energy needs. So I guess where exactly does clean energy venture capital go? Like, do you still see that as necessary to build like two projects or to have a deployable technology in order for it to scale, or do you see that happening in China, or like where does the U.S. come in? Because you also sit on Prime Coalition, which is like an interesting new way of doing.
May I ask what you are studying and where you are in your academic career?
I'm an undergrad doing engineering, business, and math.
That may be the most badass undergrad question I've ever gotten, so thumbs up. You are asking exactly the right question, and it's the one that, keeps me up at night. If, our business and M&L partners is about harvesting this pipeline, but the number of companies coming out of that pipeline gets smaller every year, we're kind of hosed, right? So, to answer your very good question, you sort of need to back up a little bit. One of the things to remember is that the venture capital field itself is undergoing a very wrenching transition that have been driven by the fact that it just doesn't cost that much money, in software and consumer companies, even consumer hardware companies, to be able to test a proposition and to know if you've got it or not. But for an industrial company, right, where scale matters, and you don't prove your economics when you build a small one, there's sort of an incompressible amount of time and money it takes to know if you've got it or not. And the same thing is true of other things. The same thing is true of pharmaceuticals, for example, and the same thing is true of kind of commodity IT hardware. So I think in general, there is a great split happening in venture capital as an asset class, where there's everything capital light over here, which is really software and consumer internet, and then there's and sort of consumer hardware, and then there's everything else over here. The VC model over here has been disrupted by micro VCs and super angels, who make decisions very quickly, and where the decision-making process of, Venrock or Kleiner Perkins or Sequoia looks archaic and slow and old. Over here, I don't think we have the answer yet. And I think the beautiful thing is that a whole bunch of different experiments are being run. Some of those experiments are about, well, maybe, my general view of the world is that, the capital over here has to have some secondary motivation, be it strategic or sovereign or philanthropic. Some people are going after, M&L Partners is, sort of at the late stage, the strategic component. Other people are doing it early. There's some utility-backed efforts like broad-scale capital, which is a sort of joint venture activity of a whole bunch of different strategic-type corporations in energy tech, There's another one called EIP, Energy Impact Partners, which just formed. That's a multi-utility LP fund. There are a bunch of others. I think that's one way. There are, long-term sort of family office vehicles. Various branches of the Pritzker family are probably best known. If you looked at battery technology, you would find that most of the recent large rounds have been led by family offices. You mentioned Prime Coalition, so that's a side effort of mine. It's my volunteer activity. It's my version of ringing the bell for the Salvation Army. I got really worried, not only about this, about you don't have early stage funding for energy technology companies, but also that there's an inverse relationship between how transformational something can be and how likely it is to be funded at the seed and Series A stage. If you were developing, the marginally better battery material, or the lower, cost solar tracker, you can probably get funded. It's pretty clear, when there's a, there's a very clear market entry vector, there's less, science risk, there's only engineering risk around the company. You can see a real outcome, there are comparables. If you're developing anything relating to the strong nuclear force, if you're developing the solar antenna, not the solar cell, the electrofuel, everybody's in a race to be third. Nobody wants to go first. The solution that we've gone after with Prime is that there's $600 billion in the U.S. sitting in family foundations. $50 billion a year of that goes out in grants. 0.1% historically goes to any kind of hard technology innovation that is not healthcare. And foundations have unique tools. They can do things called program-related investments and recoverable grants that are the only mechanisms under the U.S. tax code where you can grant money, but those dollars can come back to you. So if you think about, I want to back a whole bunch of crazy-ass early-stage energy ideas, but I think I'm going to net lose money. Well, if you back, 20 of them and you get 50 cents on the dollar back, you are a horrible investor, but you are a brilliant philanthropist. You somehow figured out some way to grant a dollar 1.5 times. That's what Prime does. So we have built a network of these family offices, and then we have a process by which we sort of catalog all of the early stage energy technology concepts in the U.S. We narrow them down to a small cohort with an annual heartbeat that we bring out to the network for funding. It's done by an investment committee that I lead. It has on it a bunch of interesting people like Nancy Fund, who leads DBL Partners, Arun Majumdar, who was the original director of ARPA-E, Tom Bagala, who does energy investment for Bill Gates. Our first investment was done last year. I was actually out there this morning. It's in a company called QuidNet Energy that is a crazy idea in grid-scale energy storage. It's not a battery, not a flow cell, not a capacitor. It is basically underground pumped hydroelectric. Think that you are using an underground waterfall to drive a turbine. Whenever you go out and frack an oil and gas site, as I think you guys tend to do out here in Texas, you do half of an energy storage job. You take a bunch of electricity, you run it into a pump, you jam water underground, and it elastically deforms the rock. The rock pushes back. How do you know? Because you get flowback water, right? The rock pushes the water out. Well, if you stuck a valve at the end and put a pressure turbine on the other side, the charging event, and you got too much power as you jam more water down, the discharge event where you don't have enough is they open that valve and drive the turbine. And because you're using disused oil and gas wells, the land asymptotically approaches free. The water's pretty cheap. As long as you got decent round trip efficiency, the numbers pencil out that you could do $30 to $50 a kilowatt hour, which is an order of magnitude less than the best projections, at the system level for batteries of $300 to $500 a kilowatt hour. And at a very carefully selected site in Erath County, Texas, near the town of Mingus. When I mentioned this to my host earlier today, they were like, both of those words are made up. I don't know those places. There is a site that is functioning. It is, the world's first underground pumped hydroelectric system, and I saw it operate today and light up a bank of halogen bulbs, and it was a badass day. So, feeling good. What else can I tell you? So, bottom line, yes, that's a big problem. There is not an answer. A whole bunch of experiments are blooming right now. I've placed my bet on a couple of them, and I want everybody to be successful because that's a big gap.
Matt, your focus is China. What about India? India will have more people than China, and they've got all kinds of issues around energy and water and what have you.
Got it. I thought you were going to end that sentence that they've got all kinds of issues, which is why we don't operate there, at least not to date. So 90% of our work is in China, and it's the only place we have ground game. We do some work in Brazil and in the Middle East, but in each case, we don't have our own ground game. We partner with a private equity firm that plays the role there, analogous to what my partner Chivas Lam does based in Shanghai. India, we've had many people who are early stage project developers from India come to us and say, I'd like to be your Indian partner, and yada, yada, yada. I've had some experience in that geography. My partner, Manuel, has had a lot more when he was with the State Department. It's just a hard place to do business. I mean, I hate to say this, it's going to sound terrible, particularly in election season, but representative democracy is a complicating factor, particularly in one that has a, rich history of a sort of license raj, a big bureaucracy that inserts friction in order to extract rents at every turn. And we found that you just have a lower friction path in these other geographies. I'd love to tackle it at some point, but I wouldn't do it without somebody who, would forget more than I'd ever know about how to get things done in that country.
Right.
Thanks, folks.